Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is December 27, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with part two with Linus Ignatius. Where in the heck are you calling in from, Linus?
Calling in from somewhere upstate New York on the dark highway roads.
How cool is that? Well, I figured we could go into film a little and just start off with I met Michael Apted about 40 years ago, the film director, and I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? And most people don't know that Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but in the 80s it really flourished with MTV, and Marty Scorsese said he cut his films faster because of MTV. Michael Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. So I asked this question with a bias. Can we indeed learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Well, it's like, I think the trade-off is, Marilyn Robinson has a quote about how we've forgotten how to think long thoughts. And so, I think I'm certainly able to take in information faster than I used to be, but at the expense of thinking a longer thought, a thought that can span time and can kind of cohere one idea over the course of a more elaborate course. So that's what I'd say to that.
In Marilyn Robinson's writing in a book, is there a title of a book or an essay?
I think she said that in an interview about why she wrote the novel Gilead. I don't know where exactly it appeared, but it's in reference to her novel Gilead.
Great. Thanks for turning me on to that. The real hidden question there, Linus, is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've heard that it's not. At the same time, I've heard that there are sometimes tasks going on in the background. So for example, like there was a time in my life when I was, the day seemed to be passing me by really quickly. And a professional I was working with suggested that my bandwidth was being sucked by some fears that were kind of running in the background. So I guess when it comes to like acute focus, I think the answer is no. But when it comes to like, processing emotion, maybe the answer is yes.
Good. You're really covering the waterfront there. I really appreciate this comprehensiveness. And so I'm curious about your framing aesthetic, how people frame things. You're in this ratio with the cell phone ratio. I'm in a different ratio. And you know about aspect ratio. But, what if informed the way how movie people hold their hands up like this, and they frame something. What informed your framing aesthetic? How did you form a framing aesthetic?
Well, like framing it carries semiotics. So, I started as a filmmaker on 16 millimeter, which is 4:3. And so, when you frame something in that more square format, it calls to mind a bygone era. And then there was a period when kind of widescreen, with black bars on top and bottom were kind of, the gold standard. And nowadays, if you throw those black bars on the top and bottom of a frame, you kind of suggest to somebody that what they're seeing is more cinematic. I think we might be kind of leaving that moment behind a little bit. I mean, there are, Everything Everywhere All at Once played a lot with aspect ratio, depending on what kind of, flashback or dimension you're in. I think Passing, which came out a couple years ago, the black and white film, I think that was 4:3 or close to it. So I've worked in a lot of different aspect ratios. I used to be kind of staunchly opposed to shooting things vertically because because even if you shot things on your phone, the medium that people were watching things on was always like a desktop computer. And then in the last year or two, or maybe a little longer, in the last few years, I've realized that like the phone is now the primary method of consumption for most people's media on social media and stuff like that. So I don't know the actual statistics, but I just anecdotally know that. So it's really changed a lot. But for me, like it's always about cinema. So it's one thing to shoot content, but it's another thing to shoot cinema. And cinema, you're entering into a space where you're going to now like leave all earthly attachments behind to enter into this medium. And yeah, so I think in those terms usually when it comes to how I shoot. Does that make sense?
That made a lot of sense, and it brought up a lot of things. Jean Cocteau said he formed his aspect ratio or his framing aesthetic by the way they put the knife and fork and spoon on the table, and that was really interesting, because when you said bygone era, I thought you really nailed it, because I'm really searching for people to say we form our framing aesthetic from the paintings and photographs we've seen in the past. How else? When Robert Frank came along and tilted the, symmetry in a photo, or people changed the way you frame a landscape, it seems so much based on the past. And why did these people, even the cave artists, why did they frame the way they did, So I think this bygone era thing you brought up was really important, because it morphs into the next question, which is about the human gaze. So I don't know if you saw this film called Brainwashed by Nina Menkins, but she was really deep into what's called the female gaze or the male gaze, and how Hollywood has had this male gaze from day one. And then, if you study Alice Guy Blanchet, the woman who invented cinema along with George Méliès, was basically blackballed out of cinema history. Did she have a female gaze, or was she basing her framing aesthetic or her gaze on what she saw growing up with paintings and photographs, which were probably more done by men than females? So then, I'm curious, is there a female gaze and a male gaze in your opinion? Because John Berger first brought it up in Ways of Seeing, that there's the human gaze. But, there is probably a distinction. Once you see Brainwashed, which I highly recommend, you already know it. There's a definite bias in males to frame a certain way because they've dominated movie history.
Right.
So
I think.
Go ahead. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think like there are a couple of different aspects of what people are referring to when they talk about like shooting something from or for the male gaze. I'm a gay filmmaker, so my films don't objectify women. At least that's not what my eye doesn't objectify women in the way that a man who's attracted to a woman would. I might objectify a woman in other ways, for fashion, for beauty, for attitude. And that's the second piece of the male gaze, which is I was raised a certain way, and so I have access to certain life experiences and not to others. I think like a lot of these things have to do with what I'm drawn to, but also like who I'm close to. Like my best friend is a trans woman, and so like the work we make together ends up being deeply informed by that. So I don't know if there's like I think we're leaving behind the era of the male gaze, the female gaze, which we needed to define those terms in a time when people weren't questioning things and it was just the gaze. People didn't realize that the camera was a power. What you decide to point the camera towards is a statement on what you decide is powerful and who's powerful and who's behind the camera and who's deciding where it goes. And so once we established that and we became clear, okay, you know, this is objectification. This is glorification of abuse or violence or hypersexualization of a you know, disempowered group. That was an important battle, and now we're in the next era, which is like, okay, you know, how do we mix this all up in a blender?
Yeah. Beautiful. So I read a comment in the LA Times once, and I'm curious your reaction to it. Film as an art form has been swindled by capitalism.
Well, film, you know, the state of film today as an art form does not exist without capitalism. I mean, film is at the intersection of artistic expression, entertainment, and finance, capital. And, you know, I mean, in order to get a film made, you're already dealing with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars as a base price. And then in order for that to be a viable investment, you need to understand what your audience is going to be. And so art for art's sake, you know, isn't really so viable in a medium where it requires so much money to get the ball rolling. So, you know, that's a constant tweak that I'm always making, is like, okay, what is that sweet spot of, you know, what people find entertaining, what is genuinely expressing what I feel, you know, needs to be in the world, and what will people put their money behind? So, you know, was there a time when film was a more pure artistic expression? I mean, yeah, but in a sense, it's still that era because people have iPhones, and I mean, I have a Samsung smartphones. Like, we still can shoot experimental stuff and put it online, and it can enter the economy of attention. You know, TikTok or whatever. You can use TikTok to make experimental films. I have a friend who does that. He doesn't get a lot of views on his stuff. So if the question is, can you still make film that's not beholden to capitalism? I think the answer is yes. But the question is like, okay, but what's your goal there? I mean, we did have, you know, a summer last year where the two blockbusters were, you know, kind of edgy. There was Barbie and there was Oppenheimer. And say what you will about them, they weren't Marvel movies. And, you know, that's kind of a statement of, okay, maybe, you know, maybe there's an intersection between capitalism and interesting art.
Yeah. It's really well put, Linus. It gives me a lot of hope. And, you know, I had this thing, the woman who shot the George Floyd killing on her cell phone, she should have won cinematography award at the Oscars. I mean, it basically ruined her life because she has nightmares because she said she should have put her camera down and saved him. And it's like, good luck. You did better holding your ground and shooting that 8 minutes of footage that was seen by millions and millions of people. So it leads into Jean-Luc Godard saying to Michael Moore when he premiered Fahrenheit 9/11 at the Cannes Film Festival, this film is going to help Bush get elected. Now, it didn't help Bush get elected per se, but it did galvanize pro-Bush people. So with this slew of political documentaries over the recent years, do they more activate people or more pacify people?
Don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I really don't know the answer to that. You know, I mean, it's like that old Chinese kind of parable about the guy whose, you know, son falls off a horse, and everybody says, "Oh, we're so sorry about your son falling off a horse." And then the army drafts all the boys in town, but because the son's arm is broken, he's not drafted, and so the son doesn't die in the war. And everybody says, "Oh, we're so, you know, you're so lucky your son didn't get drafted." And the father, you know, he always says to them, "We'll see. We'll see. You know, it's not time to celebrate. It's not time to despair, because each of these things might lead to some kind of comedy of twists." So I kind of feel that way.
Yeah.
I don't really know like what will come out in the wash.
Yeah, it's like Cindy Sheehan, the great anti-war activist. She says we're just talking to the choir, and there ain't even a choir.
Mm.
You know, which is again important because you know how many people saw The Day After Trinity, which was the film that tackled the same issues of Oppenheimer. And I recently asked the maker of that film, John Ellis, all these same questions. And he said that his film was used by the good guys and the bad guys, just like Battle of Algiers was used by Bush to teach his cronies how to handle uprisings and was used by the Black Panthers to have an uprising. So, you know, that when they asked Guido Pontecorvo, what does your film do? The maker of Battle of Algiers, he says, it teaches people how to make a film. But indeed, it is one of the
Yeah.
great, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, like, you know, you know, millennials and Gen Z tend to be far more willing to empathize with the plight of Palestinians who
Yeah,
are living under blockade, and that's
yeah,
a direct result of the power of social media.
yeah,
And you know, say what you will about the conflict, there are a lot of people who are suffering in Palestine, and
yeah,
I see a lot of Israelis who either refuse to see that or see the ends as justifying the means, and that's a result of, you know, the propaganda they're raised around. And so, you know, there is, and the intense pressure that, you know, millennials and Gen Zs in particular are putting, you know, on the publicity war around, you know, speaking up for people that are being slaughtered. um, it is having some visible ramifications in politics, not enough, but that's the, you know, and a lot of this is happening because people in Palestine are filming themselves in their apartments while the bombs are dropping out their windows. And it's a primary source. Suddenly we have access to a primary source on the ground, cutting through the fog of war in the moment. And that's very powerful.
very powerful. Well, Linus, thanks so much for your time. This is exciting for me, and I'm learning a lot. What's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Mm. I mean, ideally, I think, you know, I think rebellion is a reactive measure and revolution is an active measure.
Yeah,
So, you know, like, you can rebel and still not be clear about what you want. I mean, I liken it to kind of my life. Like, you know, I had my, like many of us do, I had my rebellious years when I was kind of anti-authority and just knew what I didn't want to be and what I didn't think society should look like. But that was very different from getting clear on what kind of society and what kind of life for myself I wanted to work towards.
yeah,
Um, and I think revolution, you know, can be quiet and it can be loud.
yeah. Yeah, my someone said two people talking is the revolution, you know, the dialogue. And then I heard this other distinguishing thing like there's the moment and then there's the movement. And
Mm-hmm.
if we can get a movement going, you might be a little more productive than just having these moments, but they're so intertwined. What's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
Well, I see a right as, you know, so I look at humanity and I say there are some basic things that I think people deserve that simply by being a human in society they deserve.
Yeah,
And, you know, that will extend to whether or not they are, you know, like, let's say, you know, healthcare, right?
yeah,
Like, I believe free healthcare is a right that all people should have.
yeah,
And I think that should exist independent of whether or not you have financial responsibilities to the economy. So I think that should exist independent of whether you are currently working a job or whether you are of age, or whether you are retired. And so, I think some people have it in their heads that you only get rights by living up to responsibilities. And, I think a right to me is more fundamental than that. And it has to do with the value of human life.
Utah Phillips is a labor activist and a folk singer. He said, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not others. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Yeah. I was just actually watching a sort of docu-series about a commune, and sort of somewhat anarchist commune. I don't know if you could technically use that term, but they made decisions similar to how the Pequots made decisions before the colonizers came to Connecticut, which is they would sit and reach consensus. And so you would, have a council, you would hold a council, and people would raise issues, and they wouldn't get up and leave the session until everybody agreed. So it wasn't a democracy where 49% are disenfranchised because 51% agree. It was, we sit and hash this out until we all understand. And I don't know that that's the way things have to be run, or if that's even practical at a larger scale. But there's a participatory aspect to communal decisions being made that that I can see as being quite powerful. And like, I'm in 12-step groups. I'm in AA, and so 12-step groups function where any 12-step group has the right to self-govern, basically, as long as it doesn't affect AA as a whole. They can make any decisions, whatever they want, whether it's changing the script, or allowing certain things, or disallowing gum or food, or whatever. And they describe it as an upside down triangle. So whenever there are so as opposed to a hierarchy where the few are at the top making decisions, the upside down triangle, this is how it kind of works. So let's say there's a kind of program-wide intergroup issue that's being decided. So a recent issue, for example, was they used to say it's a program for men and women. Well, way back they said it was a program for men, then they added women, and now they decided to they were going to vote on, should we change this to people, just so we're inclusive, and no matter what happens with gender stuff, people know that everybody's welcome. And the way they measured the votes is every local AA group voted within their group. So let's say, a group of 50, we meet every week, we vote, those votes get sent up to intergroup. And so, through that, proposals and votes are made by the plurality. And I thought that was a really interesting way to structure those types of decisions.
That was good. I like that. And, the word freedom etymologically comes from giving oneself one's own laws. And the basic question is, Linus, what does freedom mean to you now? And I'll just set it up with a couple quotes. T.S. Eliot said, freedom is only truly freedom when it appears against the background of an artificial limitation, which caused McLuhan to ask the question, how are you to argue with people who insist on sticking their heads in the invisible teeth of technology, calling the whole thing freedom? So basically, what does freedom mean to you now?
Whenever like free will comes up as a concept, I always kind of think it's silly.
Yeah.
Because I'm bound by gravity. I'm bound by the speed limit, or the fact that I might get arrested if I don't go, under the speed limit. I'm bound by my sense of obligation to the people that I care about. So, the idea of free will, which is not what you're asking, but it's what came to mind, has always struck me as kind of like a false, it's kind of like an abstraction that doesn't actually apply to anybody's situation. Freedom has is laden with such it's such an Americanism, the way it's used. Like, I just remember when I moved to the States, you know, it was right after 9/11, and it was, everything was, you know, French fries were being called freedom fries, and flags were being waved. And there was this idea that, like, America's the greatest country in the world. And I had been living in, you know, overseas my whole life. And so I was kind of like shocked to see people galvanized around this word with a capital F that, it seemed to like signify almost something else. Like, what it really signified was, we're in solidarity, and we believe that we're superior, you know? And, but at the same time, it's telling that I left Hong Kong, you know, like, when I left Hong Kong, it was still basically a functional, I don't know if you call it a democracy or a representational parliament, or, you know, I don't know the technicalities of those terms, but it was heavily democratic. And since I've left in, you know, 2002, I think, China has kind of swooped in, and they've arrested. So we have family friends who are in prison potentially for life for being journalists, criticizing the Chinese government, who were living in Hong Kong. And, you know, so freedom of the press, as in freedom of speech, you know, is no longer a reality. And so something that's so conceptual and abstract also has very real ramifications.
Wow, that was heavy. And is there hope for them? They're in jail. I mean, you can't do anything. Do you really? Can you? Or
one of our friends, his name is Jimmy Lai, and he was a lifetime journalist. He traveled between China and Hong Kong. Total, you know, revolutionary, both. And yeah, and I guess he was raided and arrested, and he's been in political prison for years now. And they keep, every time his trial date approaches, they keep postponing it another year or 2 years and saying, you know, we'll get to this when we get to it. And there's a chance that he may be in prison for the rest of his life.
Oh. Well, there's a socialist, John Basil Barnhill, who said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. And then the film V for Vendetta paraphrased that and said, people should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. How do you personally handle false fears, like the war on drugs? You can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight. You can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. Or the war on poverty, or the war on terrorism. How do you personally handle false fears?
Well, I mean, you make it, you know, it's a great kind of pithy quip about drugs can't fight. It also doesn't work, right? So if we want to like address issues of addiction, you know, which I'm very intimately involved with, it's like, you know, rational thinking would lead you to believe that you want to use evidence-based measures and not just declare war and beat your chest and, you know, and try to criminalize a population. So, you know, but yeah, I mean, that's what false fear does, which is kind of the base of your question. False fear is really tough so I've had like, oh wait, let me just make sure I'm staying in the right lane. I've had some recent kind of false fears come up for me in my dating life, and they brought up some like early childhood trauma, and that's really tough. Like, once that stuff gets activated, I'm no longer in my rational brain. You know, when that stuff gets activated, I'm in total like survival mode, pre-verbal, just feeling.
Yeah.
And so when I'm in that zone, I've had to experience this over the last few weeks and try to like soothe myself through it, which I think is a zone that, you know, a lot of people who get really worked up about things are in. You know, when I'm in that zone, like it's kind of like a red alert, and you know, there's nothing I can do other than soothe and recenter and you know, pray for the moment that the intensity passes. Because
Yeah.
anything I do, any action I take to try to change the world from that place of intensity is going to be misguided, and it's just going to tighten the knot even further. So,
Linus, what wise advice? But suss out the word soothe. I love that. I soothe myself. What does that entail?
oh wait, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Did I break up for a sec?
You broke up for a second, and my basic question was, how does one soothe themselves? That sounds like such wise advice. I love that. But just maybe suss it out. Like, how do you soothe yourself? I mean, you said recenter, pray for the moment. Those were really specific. But I'm just curious because that's a major talent that everyone should develop to soothe themselves, which means don't get overworked up on something, right? Just like chill.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if I broke up when I said it, but there's a saying: when it's hysterical, it's historical.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what my therapist has suggested is to really focus on the five senses. So, and treat it as an experiment. So, you know, what can I rest my eyes on? What can I listen to? What can I taste, touch, smell? And you know, there's an old grounding exercise, like 5 things I can see, and you name those 5 things one after another. You know, 4 things I can hear, 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, 1 thing I can taste. And by the end of that, you know, there's a grounding result. I mean, there's also, you know, there's also different types of body work, and you know, I've done breath work, and I did some biofeedback meditation, which is really fascinating. I'm into that now. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't, but in part 1, you turned me on to that amazing. Now I don't have the note in front of me, but it's like 3 letters, RMB or.
Oh yeah, EMDR.
EMDR, yeah.
Yeah. Biofeedback, I think it's a catch-all term for any way in which you're kind of getting external feedback on what's happening in your body. And so the biofeedback that I did, it's a form of meditation where you have a sort of metallic headband around your head that's measuring your brain activity, and you have headphones in that are playing a soundscape of a beach. And when your brain activity goes up, you start to hear storm clouds and thunderclaps and wind. And when your brain activity goes down, you start to hear the waves lapping, and you start to hear birds.
Oh my God.
Through this feedback that you're getting, and it just measures electrical activity. It's not super sophisticated. It just tells you if there's activity or not. And through that feedback, it starts to give you a felt sense of, this is what it feels like for me to be calm. Oh, this is what it actually feels like in my body to return to baseline. So I did a session of that, you know, a few weeks ago, and I liked it so much that I got my own biofeedback machine. So, yeah.
Are they very expensive? How much do they cost about?
They certainly can be, but the one that I got was like $200, I think.
No, $200 is not. So is this, have you ever explored Jungian therapy?
Not Jungian therapy, but I've read some of Jung's writing.
Yeah. Well, I really like the focus on the 5 senses. Again, you're really teaching me a lot. And I'm curious, how do we get our governments from going to war?
Honestly, the only thing I can think of is money, boycotts. You know, like it took, what was it, ExxonMobil, I think, or was it BP? One of those 2 corporations, I believe, put out a statement that they they were basically embargoing the UK, I think, based on their involvement in Israel-Palestine. And within an hour, the UK, government had called for a ceasefire.
Wow.
So I would double check my sources. On that. It's been a couple weeks since I read that. But I think that's the only thing that talks, money. Starbucks right now is experiencing a pretty profound drop in its share value because of Gen Z and millennials boycotting Starbucks based on their response to Israel-Palestine. And
Wow.
Starbucks is panicking, and they're trying to cast for an ad somebody just posted a casting listing of Starbucks. They're casting anybody in a hijab to appear in their next ad because they're so freaked out about their publicity being besmirched. And so money talks.
Wow. Really good. I once said that. I said the only way we're going to affect the military industrial complex is if no one goes to work and no one buys anything. And I said it at an art gallery in Venice where there were 5 gutter punks in the front row, and they go, "That's what we do." And I said, you buy potato chips. Everybody buys something, and it's hard. It would be so hard to collapse our economy by not buying anything and not going to work. But would that end war? It would be an amazing thing because you brought it down to the
yeah. There's been a study. Oh wait, can you hear me? Am I breaking up?
I can hear you good.
Okay, great. There's been a study. I wish I had the numbers, but basically this study showed that, once you have, I think it's something like 15% of all people, when you have 15% of all of the population, maybe it's less, maybe it's 5%. I would check this out. But there's some critical mass where once you reach that amount of people demonstrating, every single revolution, every single social cause has won.
Wow.
And so, and it's like it happened in Mexico in the streets. It happened in Venezuela. It's like you can see it again and again when people take to the streets and you hit this critical number. I wish I remembered. Maybe it's 5%. Maybe it's 11%.
Yeah.
But, there is some measurable value where if you activate that amount, and it's nowhere near 50%, it's nowhere near what you would need to win a Democratic vote.
Yeah. No, it's hopeful. And there's a New York Times article I read in 2017, and I thought it brought up 2 big questions. It said the cable news business model is conflict means urgency, and urgency means viewers glued to the channel. So it seeks out arguments and pushing buttons. It's a machine designed to generate stress and negative emotion. Then he went into Trump does not exactly lack that. His entire career has been fighting is humankind's most productive state. So my 2 questions are, what is humankind's most productive state? Is it fighting? And is conflict the human condition?
I think fighting is like extremely destructive, actually, quite the opposite. I had a friend in college who thought that competition was the father of all invention, and I just could not disagree more, because when I'm in competition, I get tunnel vision. I don't see right. I make impulsive decisions. Everything I do is tainted with an anxiety. When I'm with a trusting group, that's when, they say, like, when you're dating, the best way to get to know somebody is in a friend group where you're all bantering.
Yeah.
Because when you're one-on-one, it creates this awkward sense of pressure.
Yeah.
And so I think the less pressure somebody feels, and when I say pressure, I don't mean, expectation to do a good job. I mean like pressure, like you're going to suffer if you don't do a good job.
Yeah.
The more, the better people are. That's just my belief. That's how I run a film set.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. And both Krishnamurti and McLuhan said violence is the human search for identity. Any thoughts on that line?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what Eckhart Tolle says, like, anytime we become entrenched in an idea, we have entered into this mode where your ego is now gripping. And we've become identified with something that is far less than the self with a capital S. And so, and it happens to me all the time. I'm not saying this because I'm beyond it or above it. But when I get into that place, it's because I feel threatened. Something about me feels threatened. So I grip to something, and that's what I attach myself to. So I agree wholeheartedly with that idea.
Yeah.
And then also there was something that I read about, it was a podcast I think I was listening to, and they talked about how the more threatened somebody feels, the more likely they are to engage in kind of in-group behavior. And I felt that, I totally felt that. Like, I am much more likely to engage in fights online when I'm scared that, my rights are going to be taken away.
Yeah. Yeah, fill in the blank, Linus. Anger can be a productive emotion when
it's felt and experienced. I think it's reacted to because we think that by reacting, it'll go away. But I think that the biggest challenge is learning to weather difficult emotions. I mean, it's really a somatic experience of how can I let a difficult emotion that's activating me to pass through my body. And that's feeling the feelings is actually a very active process. So that's what I think about that. And, I'm working on being able to express anger by explaining to somebody that I'm angry. I never used to be able to do that. So there's something powerful there too, but it starts with being able to feel it, feel the sensation of it, not run from it, not try to make it go away.
But then how did you learn how to express it? By talking to the person, and you didn't want to alienate them, right? But you didn't want to fight with them. But how did you learn that technique of explaining that you're angry?
I think it starts with being able to tolerate the feeling, because once I tolerate the feeling, I don't have to do anything to make it go away.
Yeah.
So when I lash out, it's because the pressure of the anger is causing me to lash out in the false belief that this will somehow cure the anger.
Yeah.
This is what the anger hungers for in order to be satisfied. And so if I stop that whole feedback loop and I say, my end goal here is experiencing this feeling, then any action I choose to take is not coming from a place of I'm letting this anger hunger fuel me. So I think it starts there.
Yeah. Do you think you learned that more from the way your parents raised you or more on your own?
I've been in therapy on and off since I was 7. So I think I learned it from a lot of that, actually. I've always been interested. Part of me wants to go back to school to become maybe a social worker, because I've always been interested in counseling and therapy, and certainly have a lot of it under my belt. So that's where I learned most of that. You're
certainly well versed in it, my friend. You have good, you know how to express your thoughts and be articulate and concise. And I can understand you. I appreciate this. What's more important, Linus, conviction or compromise?
Trying to think of a real world example. Yeah, there was a Pequot massacre in the 1800s, I believe, 1812, maybe, don't quote me. But to commemorate it, every year the Mashantucket Pequots have a gathering at their museum where they kind of talk about the history. And anyway, that's where I learned that the Pequots used to agree to things in consensus. And one of the things we had to do is we broke up into groups, and our group had to decide based on consensus what we would rather give up: freedom, identity, or land. And it was very interesting to watch, because there were a couple of people who had extreme convictions, and I've sensed kind of other people in the group sort of like bending to that and thinking, well, I can see both sides, but I'll just make this easier. And I was kind of in an interesting position, because I had my own extreme conviction, but I could see that we were never going to reach consensus if I dug in my heels. So I was honest about how I felt about the answer, and I said, but I'm willing to be swayed. And I thought, that feels like the most productive way to come to this type of conversation. It's like, how can I come with the spirit of both? So it's a bit of a cop out, but I think that's an example of being able to put both into practice, because then it meant we could have a conversation.
Yeah, I agree. That's my oldest question. 40 years I've been asking that. I learned it from Christine McKenna. And I'm amazed by it, because it took 25 years before someone went, what's more important, conviction or compromise? And the guy goes, it depends on what you mean by important. So he really shifted the emphasis. But my bias is I want people to say compromise, because everybody's convicted from day one for something, but it's hard to compromise. And you're saying I'm willing. That's a step forward, just to say I'm willing to hear you out, and let's work on this and have find a commonality. And so what is ambition based more on fear or joy? Your observations of humans.
I mean, God, ambition almost is like too blunt a word to define. It encompasses moments for me that are driven by fear and moments for me that are driven by joy. Orson Welles, at the end of his career, he said, what have I done? I've spent the last 50 years, 40 years, however long, trying to prove something to people that weren't interested in what I had to say.
Yeah.
And, and you see that in even Citizen Kane, like this kind of maniacal ambition, not only in the character Citizen Kane, but also in Orson Welles creating it. There was a strong sense of like he had to prove something to the world. And, so like, and I've done a lot of projects with that kind of same energy. And at the same time, like when I hit upon a project that, like right now I'm working on a film that I'm shooting this summer, and you could say it's ambitious. It's got a lot of moving parts. It's complicated. It's magical realist, all these things. But when I work on it, it doesn't feel like it's driven by ambition. It feels like it's driven by vision.
Yes. Good.
It feels like it's driven by, and so the vision to me is more driven by joy, but this sort of ambition, like I want to achieve a certain status, feels very driven by fear. So I don't know if the words clearly divide themselves one way or another, but that's how I kind of describe it for myself.
In Linus, in your accomplishments, how do you rate these three elements, luck, skill, and ambition? What played the biggest role, second and third?
Well, skill plays a huge role, because my early films were so bad. And so, it's like you gotta just keep making stuff until you're better. Luck has played a huge role for me too, because to be a filmmaker these days, it's a lot easier if you come from privilege. And, I've been fortunate enough to have, a relatively cushy financial situation to be able to take risks. Not to mention people I've happened to meet and whatever, luck in that sense too, fate. And ambition has been the thing that, drives me to get up in the morning and do the next thing. So you said, what was the question? Which one has been more? Or what?
Well,
Remind me of the question.
You sussed it out well. You know, it's just sort of rating them or just sussing each one out, luck, skill, and ambition. It's funny, just briefly, I'll tell you. I asked
Mm.
people for years, what's ambition based on more, fear or joy? And then I read Friedkin, the director of Exorcist, said in Hollywood, skill and luck have nothing to do with it. It's all ambition. So George Manupelli, a film hero of mine, says, ignore yourself. The same mantra that Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making, filmmaking, more self-expression or more your vehicle for whatever technologies, environments, and cultures are dominant?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like self-expression sometimes smacks of a very kind of solipsistic attitude. And like I was saying before, like film, you know, can't exist without an audience. I mean, you know, a theater, the smallest theaters have what, 50 seats at least, and film exists to be franchised. So, you know, there's a certain amount of zeitgeist that a film has to play to in order to be successful. You know, but at the same time, like from a new age perspective, really going deep with self, you know, in theory, taps you into the zeitgeist. So I forgot the question already.
Yeah, is it more self-expression or more the zeitgeist, the being the vehicle?
So, I mean, the thing with filmmaking, like for somebody like me who's breaking in still, nobody's gonna care unless I do something nobody's ever seen before or done before. So, you know, you get this Picasso effect where like the stuff that people like make their name off of is so bold and original and just this unique kind of flavor. And then they start self-plagiarizing.
Yeah.
So, you know, in my moment, I think self-expression is probably, you know, more important, but not at the expense of marketability.
Yeah. Can art making be egoless?
I sure don't know how. If somebody's figured it out, I'd love to read their book because I don't know. Maybe.
Beautiful. T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
It's all in images. I don't really think in words very often. I don't have so much of an inner monologue. Dreams. Yeah, sense impressions. Yeah, I don't have a string of dialogue going on in my head usually, which I think some people find unusual. Yeah.
What was the motive of the cave artist? Your hunch or guess?
Well, depends on the cave art. I mean, I think some cave art has, you know, they've kind of speculated and maybe even uh-oh. Did I disappear? Can you hear me still?
You buzzed out for a second there, but you go ahead. What was the motive of the cave artist? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it depends on the cave art. I've you know there's this one series of ancient cave paintings where there was, you know, these symbols in the corner and people weren't sure what they meant, and I think somebody cracked the code and realized that it represented the gestation cycle of the you know, the wildebeest or the bison being tracked in a calendar. So I think there was practical application, but I also had a cinema teacher who described cave painting as the first film.
Yeah.
First, when you held a flickering flame up to them, they moved like stroboscopic images.
Yeah. Yeah, Herzog explored that in his movie. Is perception
Yeah.
reality?
In college, I got really into the Merleau-Ponty and the phenomenologists, who kind
Yeah.
of do away with the idea of an objective reality, and instead they talk about an intersubjectivity. And I always found that quite compelling, because it sort of presents a third option, not "I think therefore I am," and not the reality, but the experience. And I think, you know, quantum mechanics and quantum physics sort of, suggest that things exist in a field of probability until they have to resolve themselves into an objective point. And that to me suggests that there's some fluidity between objective reality and potential reality.
That's good, Linus. You broke up a little there, but I basically got the gist of it. It's sort of what you're saying. The breakup contributes to the actual thought. It's like the form and the content becomes one at times. It was really beautiful because it fits right into the next. McLuhan probed Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, saying artists dream awake. We all have this amazing capacity to create these scenarios while we sleep, but artists can also do that while they're awake, dreaming awake. Have dreams played a role in your creative process?
Oh, deeply. Yeah. The very first experimental the film I had forgotten, but I remembered during a meditation recently that it's loosely based on the first nightmare I had as a kid. Yeah, there's something primal that happens in dreams that gives you a lot of fodder, a lot of symbolic fodder.
Indeed. And let's go into Joyce a little. Tell us your history, because I know you have some interest in James Joyce. Did you start reading him as assignments in literature classes or on your own? And what Joyce have you read that's had an impact on you?
Yeah, I started reading Joyce in high school as part of a Joyce class I took. And we read Dubliners and Portrait and then Ulysses, although we skipped, I think, 3 different chapters in Ulysses just for time's sake. And then during the pandemic, I got back into Ulysses, and I found different James Joyce reading groups, and I ended up joining, actually right before the pandemic hit, I ended up joining a Finnegan's Wake reading group. And so, I've been working through Finnegan's Wake with these different folks, including Adam Harvey, who I think maybe you know or know about. And he's in Santa Fe. And I also, in college, I got to play James Joyce in a play written about his life and Lucia Joyce's life called Lucia Mad. And it sort of documents her descent into kind of schizophrenia or whatever you want to call the diagnosis, but madness, and her relationship with Samuel Beckett and her relationship with her father. And James Joyce has had a profound impact on me. And I would love to one day see a really excellent biopic made about Lucia Joyce, because it's an incredible story.
It's needed. Yeah, there's a big Beckett film just about to come out, and I'm curious how they're going to handle that. But yeah, I know Adam Harvey. I've asked him all these questions before and attended his meetings and saw him perform at in Berkeley, some of Finnegan's Wake. So, and do you go to the Adam group online or in person?
Exactly. I go online now. It's only online because since the pandemic, their membership has become scattered.
Yeah. So a couple things, Linus, on Joyce. What is your take on what he meant by epiphanies and everydayness?
So I mean, I think epiphanies are like the moment the brain changes in some way. You know, and it's like, how does life? It's like the Chekhov quote, like, how does life happen? It happens, you know, around boring dinner tables and, you know, in the daily doldrums. That's not a direct Chekhov quote, but he said something to that effect. And you know, you find yourself sitting at the dinner table with family, and suddenly your heart is breaking, and nothing particularly dramatic has happened. And so, you know, to me, like, Joyce is trying to tell dramatic stories as faithfully, at least until Finnegan's Wake, tell dramatic stories as faithfully to an actual day-to-day human experience as possible.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, and it's very similar to a filmic concept, actually, because, you know, in film school, they drilled into me, like, we don't need to see the person walk through the door. We just need to see the decision they make to go inside.
Yeah.
So, you know, life is a series of decisions, and a character arc is a series of decisions. And, you know, what are the circumstances that lead up to these decisions that are somewhat minute, but actually, you know, in the course of a life, like if you think about Run, Lola, Run, you know, the butterfly effect of you run into somebody, you know, one day and their whole life has changed. Like in the butterfly effect, you know, these snapshot epiphanies might have profound recourse, you know, down the line. And so I think that's what he's trying to capture.
Linus, I've interviewed some of the greatest Joycean scholars on earth, and nobody's explained it as well as you have. That was really good. Epiphanies and everydayness. I'm really happy. And then in Portrait, Joyce says 3 key words. He says, I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. What do those 3 words mean to you, or what do you think Joyce was saying?
Well, I think they'd look really great on a, you know, sweatshirt in like slasher font: silence, exile, cunning. It's totally like a moody 22-year-old, you know, feeling really emotional. You know, I mean, the exile piece seems clearer to me, right? Because he's about to go to France and he's disavowing his, you know, his identity as an Irishman, instead saying, you know, my identity as an artist or as a poet. The silence piece is less clear, but it almost reminds me of like Emerson's transparent eyeball. Like, if I can disappear and instead become like a very faithful you know, create very faithful representation of the thing I'm trying to capture. And then cunning, I think, is the artifice, right? That's the Daedalus. That's the, you know, I'm going to invent new forms. I think there's a term, scrupulous meanness, I think is the term for describing how Joyce writes his characters in Portrait. I mean, in Dubliners, this kind of detail-oriented effect where, you know, the person's personality almost rubs off on the narration style. That to me feels connected to the idea of silence also.
Really good, Linus. And another line I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscious of my race. Especially the end of that, the smithy of my soul, the uncreated conscious of my race.
Yeah, have you seen I think it's a New Yorker cartoon where it's Joyce's refrigerator, and on it says, you know, 1, go to the post office; 2, pick up dog food; 3, forge in the smithy of my soul the unconscious, 4.
You know. I haven't seen that, but I loved having it described to me, so I didn't have to look at it. The New Yorker gets me a little. Sometimes I'm a little upset because the New Yorker seems to just coddle to rich people. I mean, I love it. It's an amazing magazine, and it's the lifeblood of so much. But it's like, yeah. So what is it? What do you think that is? What is the smithy of my soul, in your opinion?
Oh, well, the Smithy of My Soul piece feels a little clearer to me, actually, because it's, you know, any artist, I guess, is doing that, right? They're you know, taking in input and then trying to kind of alchemize these different sources and their perceptions into, you know, a clear image.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me is like him as a poet. That's how he describes his poetic process.
Yeah.
The uncreated conscience of my race is, it's so funny to me because, you know, if he's talking about his race as an Irishman, he's like incredibly derisive towards Irish people. I mean,
Yeah.
and when I say Irish people, I mean commoners. You know, he wants to depict them, and yet he's calling them flabby, and he's portraying them all as drowning drunks, and you know, and I'm sure that was accurate in a way. But I think he has this kind of love-hate relationship to the common people. Maybe when he says my race, he doesn't mean the Irish race, and maybe instead he means his, you know, more epic race, like his race of like-minded people, his race of artists, his race of rebels, his race of, you know, I don't know. And in which case, Portrait of the Artist feels like a very clear expression of that. You know, I've never seen this before in the world, and thus by putting this out there, I will kind of send out a sort of lighthouse signal so that others can find their way back.
Yeah.
That's what I'd say to that.
Well, Linus, Harold Bloom, who loved The Wake, said the artist absorbs their influence and then abandons them. Like, how do you do that? Like Joyce absorbed Dante and Vico and Bruno, and then did he abandon them? I mean, how do you do that? How do you absorb and abandon? Is there a process or?
Well, I had a clown teacher once. He studied with this French clown kind of master. My teacher's name was Aitor Basuri. And he would say to us, you kill every one of your teachers. There comes a time in your life where you kill every one of your teachers. And sometimes it's time for the teacher to die. And I don't know that I think that's something that comes with time.
Yeah.
I don't think it's something that happens right out the gate, but I mean, I certainly killed one or two of my teachers in terms of like disavowed everything that they claimed was the way, while at the same time recognizing that I only came to that by working their way.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like Joyce was deeply changed by all of those classic texts that he read, and, you know, and saw that as the pantheon that he wanted to participate in. And at the same time, he was kind of an iconoclast, and, you know, he likes to tear shit down and make it his own and, you know, piss all over it. That's how I take that. Just a heads up, I have to head out in 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Tell me one element of your art that has stayed the same and one element that's changed in the years you've been doing it.
Well, one that's changed is I used to make stuff that was really heavy and really like drama in a way that really demanded your emotional investment. Serious.
Yeah.
And then it was after I saw Parasite and I realized filmmaking can be extremely fun without being at the expense of bringing up some serious issues.
Yeah.
And I never forgot that. And Everything Everywhere All at Once does the similar thing where it's incredibly entertaining and it's profound. And so that's changed a lot. You know, the last thing I made was a kind of zany comedy, which is now on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. And my next film is kind of a, you know, fantasy horror magical realist piece. The thing that stayed the same, I think irony. I think I've always had a deeply ironic sense, you know, like in my first film about body dysmorphia, you know, like the character at the end has gained a pound and he's like celebrating at the end, but the audience is not celebrating with him because they realize how fucked up this guy's life is, that he's caught in this cycle. And you know, these characters that think they have a win, but the audience is pushed to believe that there's actually a loss.
Yeah.
You know, that's something I've always kind of loved, and maybe that comes from, you know, I was raised on Brecht. Like, I studied Brecht when I was in theater school, and Brecht is so much about, you know, that ironic sense of detachment.
Yeah, really important. And so why don't we close with this one? Moshe Feldenkrais says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength. Normally, we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness that you turned into a strength.
Oh yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind is hypervigilance. So, like, I developed, because of the way I was raised, I developed like an extreme hypervigilance, constantly scanning people for their emotional states in order to, you know, best adapt myself to the situation and not rock the boat, etc. And that turned me into like an incredibly I'm very good at spinning many plates and running a film set. And I've done a lot of work as a first AD, where your job is to run the set and make sure every department is happy and keep morale high. And how do I do that? I take all those superpowers that were drilled into me, and I use them to make money. You know?
Yeah. It's good. Well, Linus, it's been an honor and a pleasure. I sure would love to do a part 3 somewhere down the road, maybe 6 months down the road, because we still haven't gotten to all the questions, but you really sussed out a lot for me, taught me a lot, and enlightened me. Thank you so much for your time and energy, especially when you were multitasking big time. Very articulate. Right. Very articulate on the road. And, you know, the reception was amazing, dude. There were a few breakups, but I could really hear you loud and clear. So thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, my pleasure, man. I know one of your first questions is about whether people can multitask. I didn't even think of the irony there.
You did really well. Thank you so much, Linus. We'll be in touch.
All right, man. You too.
Thanks.